Hello and welcome back to the channel, everybody. Today I wanted to change it up from our usual quick looks and Magic Arena gameplay videos, and I wanted to try something new. Something I want to start breaking more into is just regular videos that just don't revolve around actual gameplay and just pose questions and just looking at cards, because that's what I love to do. So today I wanted to focus on something that Neon Dynasty really brings to the table, and that's vehicles. So vehicles were first introduced in Kaladesh, and that's actually when I first started getting really into standard Magic, was in that Kaladesh block. And so vehicles have just improved, and they have been pushed in other areas throughout the most recent sets of Magic until now we get Kamigawa and Neon Dynasty, where mechs and vehicles seem to be a little bit more in-universe rather than something like Kaldheim, where they were pushing boats and chariots, even though those pesky cats definitely went S tier and made every green deck completely busted. And what I found interesting was that actually mono blue has the highest percentage of vehicles besides colorless. Mono blue vehicles are at 10.7%, whereas red and white are tied at 7.1, green is at 3.6, black is the lowest at 1.8, and then there's actually a mix. There's an Azorius vehicle slot of 3.6, and I'm assuming that's because of the new commanders that came out in the Azorius vehicles deck. And all of these are stats provided after Kamigawa Neon Dynasty has released. So in the spirit of things, we need to go back to where it all started, and we need to go back to Kaladesh and talk about the vehicles that first came up. And honestly, I'm thinking I'm going to leave out the commons and uncommon vehicles as they don't really make a huge splash, but I really want to focus on the rares and mythic vehicles, so that way we can get a better sense of that slot and where it was at the start of the vehicle train and where we're at now with mythic and rare vehicles. So the first vehicle I want to look at is Aether Sphere Harvester. So sitting at 3 mana, we have a 3/5 flying artifact vehicle. When Aether Sphere Harvester enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy counters. You pay 1 energy counter, and Aether Sphere Harvester gains lifelink until end of turn with a crew 1. So right off the bat, Aether Sphere Harvester is pretty busted, with 3 mana being a 3/5 body with flying. You get 2 energy. You can use 1 energy to give it lifelink, so you're recouping on life, and you get 2 energy. If you have nothing else in your deck that gives you energy besides Aether Sphere Harvester, you get 2 pops off of that, and you gain 6 life, more or less. It's a crew 1, so it's not even, you're turning a 1/1 token basically into a 3/5 flyer with lifelink. Aether Sphere Harvester is very good, and I remember it being in a lot of decks, and if this was in your pre-release pack at the time of Kaladesh, you were going to walk out of there with first place. The next one I want to talk about is the Heart of Kiran. Now this thing, I remember me and my buddies pulling a couple of these, and we wanted to just sell them right away. This was the hot card for a little bit. The Heart of Kiran is a 2 mana 4/4 flying vigilance crew 3 vehicle. You may remove a loyalty counter from a planeswalker you control rather than pay the Heart of Kiran's crew cost. So honestly, I don't really remember this comboing with planeswalkers when it first came out, but this was like the mythic vehicle of the set that was new and fun. It had flying and vigilance, and you could get around that crew 3 cost, if you were just doing like a Super Friends in standard or something. So the Heart of Kiran being at 4/4 with flying was definitely great. It got around, it stayed around as a blocker, so you could remove that loyalty from your planeswalker on your turn and then crew it with creatures on your opponent's turn for a blocker. The Heart of Kiran is good, but I can definitely see why there was that price dip at one point as Kaladesh moved further on. Still a pretty good vehicle, if not more average, for a mythic slot rather than the Aether Flux being at rare. Next, I want to talk about a card that is actually a huge staple in my Urza deck. It is the Sky Sovereign Console Flagship. So you have to pay 5 mana to get a 6/5 flying. Whenever Sky Sovereign Console Flagship enters the battlefield or attacks, it deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls. It also has crew 3. So the crew 3, it's pretty good for a 6/5 with flying, but mainly what I love Skyship Sovereign to do is you enter the battlefield, it's gonna just lightning bolt stuff, and in colors like mono blue, which can't really deal damage to things, you get your reality shifts and your whatnot, you can return stuff to your opponent's hands, but in mono blue, especially in artifact centric deck, I love bringing this thing down, and I can just beam planeswalkers with this. My opponents set up a good board, they get their utility walker out, they're at a low loyalty number, and I just cast this, get around all their blockers, blast their planeswalker, and then I have a 6/5 flyer that I can crew for 3, so I can have Urza and a couple other smaller creatures turn into a giant 6/5 blocker that's going to deal 3 damage whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks. I love the Sky Sovereign console flagship. Next, I want to talk about everybody's favorite little tiny escape helicopter, the Smuggler's Copter. So for 2 mana, you get a flying 3/3 vehicle. Whenever Smuggler's Copter attacks or blocks, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So you loot, and then it's got that really beautiful crew 1. So it's a 2 mana 3/3 crew 1. So you got there your classic 1, 2, 3 spin on here, and it loots you a card when it attacks or blocks. This thing keeps you in the game. It's a good flyer early, and it can also just get around stuff late. I mean, 3/3 in the air is definitely not bad. Smuggler's Copter is definitely, I wouldn't say busted, but it is definitely high-end card. Like, this is where you want to be sitting at. This is just does everything, and like I said, those 1/1 tokens can crew this thing. It's so beautiful. So after the vehicles of Kaladesh, now I want to break more into the vehicles of Ixalan, which I believe was the following set. So they had learned, and they moved away from futuristic flying ships and race cars to basically pirate ships. So the first one I'd like to talk about is the Conqueror's Galleon. So for 4 mana, you get a 2/10. Whenever Conqueror's Galleon attacks, exile it at the end of combat, then return it to the battlefield transformed under your control. And it's a crew 4. So you have a crew 4. You can use it as a blocker, being 2/10, which I guess is okay, but mainly you want to flip it, and it flips actually into a land, Conqueror's Foothold. So it taps to add a colorless mana, or you can pay 2 and tap it and draw a card and discard a card, pay 4 and tap it, draw a card, pay 6 and tap it, return target card from your graveyard to your hand. So I guess there's just a lot of utility on this thing. Honestly, I have never really interacted with this card in a game of EDH or in Standard at the time when it was out. I'm not drawn to this whole, I need to pay 4 mana, then I need to crew and attack with this 2/10. Hope it doesn't, I mean, I don't think it would die, but you transform your 2/10 creature that you paid 4 mana for to a land, which now taps for colorless mana, and then I need to invest more mana into it and tap my new land to get stuff. It just, I really don't even want to touch this card. I don't really see a point of this being in a deck or just slotting this in anywhere. I'm not understanding it. I think this was definitely a low end, a waste for a rare slot in Ixalan. Next, we're going to talk about the Shadowed Caravel. So for 2 mana, we get a 2/2. Whenever a creature you control explores, put a 1/1 on the Shadowed Caravel, and then it's a crew 2. So this one, I think, definitely hits a design spot in more like of a tactical sense of you're going to build a standard deck with a lot of exploring. But again, I don't remember seeing this card at all, and I knew that there were a couple explore key cards in the Ixalan Standard Pro League, especially with things like Jade Light Ranger, and Shadowed Caravel just never came around. And you can't really put this in any of your EDH decks unless you're exploring. So this card, again, I feel like is just a miss in a rare slot. It's a 2 mana, 2/2, crew 2. You got 2/2 across the board, and you get counters on it. I can see how it would be good, but it just never really hit a mark with anything. It never really aspired to be anything. So unfortunately, it was another miss, which is not starting out strong for Ixalan, unfortunately. And next, we would be moving on to the War of the Spark era with the rares that came with that. And the first one we're going to talk about is the Mizzium Tank. So for 1 and 2 red, 3 mana in total, you get a 3/2 trample artifact vehicle. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Mizzium Tank becomes an artifact creature and gets 1/1 until end of turn. So you can actually, this becomes a creature. You don't have to crew it or anything. It comes with the crew 1 if you aren't casting a non-creature spell, but I don't see why you would be using this if you're not casting non-creature spells in your deck. So it basically gets prowess and it becomes a creature, which definitely seems pretty good. But in Standard, I think the 3 mana investment that you have to make, it doesn't have haste, so you're needing to wait until turn 4. And then at turn 4, how many instants and sorceries are you really going to cast? It comes on a 3/2 body, which can easily just be shocked if you're not casting a bunch of stuff. It's got the built-in trample, which seems nice, but again, I can see why this card would be okay rather than busted like something like Smuggler's Copter. Next, the card we're going to talk about is the Silent Submersible. So for 2 mana, blue, you get a 2/3 submarine. Whenever Silent Submersible deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, you just draw a card. You don't loot, you don't have to look and scry, you just draw a card, which seems pretty nice. And it comes with a crew 2. So unfortunately, at 2 mana being 2 blue, you can't even pay colorless, so it has to go in your intensive blue decks. It's a 2/3, so it's not exactly a big body, doesn't have trample, doesn't have unblockable. You have to crew 2, so you're not crewing it with a 1/1 like you could just a regular token or something. This card just seems like a really weird investment that on turn 3, your opponent would probably have some sort of blocker, and anything past turn 3, when you could actually attack with this thing, it's just going to die to some 4/4 or 5/5 that's going to be in another color. So I can see why Silent Submersible just never really hit its stride with anything, and again, I can't see putting this in any commander deck. You'd have to give it Shroud and Haste and Unblockable, and there's just other cards in Commander that are going to have that on it. You don't really need that from a vehicle that you need to crew. Next, we're going to talk about the Parhelion 2. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. So for 6 white, 8 mana in total, it's a huge investment in white. But what we're getting is a flying first strike vigilance 5/5. Whenever Parhelion 2 attacks, create 2 4/4 white angel creature tokens with flying and vigilance that are attacking. Crew 4. Holy word garbage that is on that card. Just vomit everywhere. So for 8 mana, we get a gigantic flying first strike vigilance building at 5/5, which definitely seems like a pretty good power toughness for this thing. But then it combos and comes in with 2 angels that have vigilance that are not tapped and attacking. They are just straight up ready to block after this combat. So we're getting a total of 13 power on the board. We attack with one thing. It's a crew 4. Like, that is just, you crew 4 to get a 5/5, and it brings in 2 angels that don't leave the battlefield. I wouldn't even be surprised if it said exile those tokens at the beginning of your end step. But no, you just get to keep the angels, and they're untapped and ready to block. I know why this thing didn't go anywhere in Standard, because it's 8 mana, especially being 6 white. But in Commander, that is totally achievable, especially with cheating things out onto the battlefield. This thing would be a tank powerhouse if you can land it and actually attack with it. But I can see why just the mana investment is so high. You almost have to cheat this thing in for it to have any value in your deck. But so far, not exactly the worst thing ever. It's definitely got an upside, but to hit that upside, you're going to have to do a lot of work. But all in all, War of the Spark didn't do too bad with vehicles. I don't think we were at the point in Kaladesh, but they're all right. I can see using some of these sometimes. All right, the next rare and mythic vehicles that I want to talk about are the sets that were in between. The upcoming set that we're going to talk about in the last set. So that is actually, the first one we're going to talk about is going to be Cultivators Caravan. And this card is definitely an interesting slot for me. I've tried to use this in some commander decks, and it just never really hits what you want it to. But it's 3 mana, and it's a 5/5, and it taps, and you add 1 mana of any color. And then you can crew 3, so you just kind of have a 5/5 laying around for later. But then it basically is just a Commander Sphere with a downside of not drawing you a card later. And that's honestly why I switch it for Commander Sphere a lot of the times. Like, the Commander Sphere being able to draw you a card later in the game rather than becoming a 5/5 creature. The 5/5 just seems irrelevant sometimes late in Commander games. Cultivators Caravan is good for what it is. It's a 3 mana tap, add 1 mana of any color, so that's the Commander Sphere side of it. But then the Commander Sphere edges it out because of the card draw. This just becomes a 5/5 creature. You have to invest 3 power into it, so you're not really getting a huge trade-off for it. Kind of a miss, but definitely can see its uses, especially in some kind of budget 5-color deck, maybe. The next one I want to talk about is the Dermotaxi. So for 2 mana, there's a 0/0 artifact vehicle with imprint. As Dermotaxi enters the battlefield, exile a creature card from a graveyard, so it doesn't have to be your own. Tap 2 untapped creatures you control. Until end of turn, Dermotaxi becomes a copy of the exiled card, except it's a vehicle artifact, in addition to its other types. So there's no way to crew, it just becomes a copy of the creature. So That does get around enter the battlefield trigger, so you're not going to copy a Mole Drifter and get to draw 2 cards because the Dermotaxi becomes a copy, so it doesn't enter the battlefield. It's just becoming the creature. So if it has an attack trigger, it would definitely be useful, but other than that, the Dermotaxi, again, is just, you have to tap 2 untapped creatures, so you could tap 2 tokens, but it just has to be 2. It's not something where you can crew 4 and have a 1 creature with power 4 crew this. You have to tap 2. So again, not bad, but there's just not really a reason to use the Dermotaxi, especially as you can only really get combat triggers from it. The next and last one we're going to talk about before we get to the Kaladesh section is going to be one of my favorites, just for a artwork and flavor standpoint, would be the Weatherlight. So for 4 mana, we get a 4/5 flying artifact vehicle. Whenever Weatherlight deals combat damage to a player, look at the top 5 cards of your library, and you may reveal a historic card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest at the bottom in a random order. So artifacts, legendary, sagas are historic, with crew 3. Now this is mythic, and I wouldn't say that this is like the best artifact vehicle ever, but I just love it because throughout Magic's history and Magic's lore, Urza is one of my favorite characters. And the artwork of the Weatherlight, just seeing the ship among the clouds, having this card in foil is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. I love the realistic depictions of all the Dominaria arts, and this thing is just one of my favorite cards for a lore and flavor and artwork. This card is definitely one of my favorite cards to come out of Magic in the most recent years, and I just had to talk about this. It is in my Urza deck for flavor. And my friends sometimes ask me why it's in there, because it has to deal combat damage, and then you get to dig a little bit. And it's not, and it's a crew 3 with flying. It's only a 4/5. It doesn't really do anything that crazy, but I have to leave it in just for the pure flavor and the awesomeness to show off the artwork. All right, and now we're going to get to the Kaldheim section of this video. Now, there are only 2 cards that we're going to end up looking at, and the first one is going to be Cosima, God of the Voyage. So for 2 and a blue, we get a 2/4 legendary creature god. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may exile Cosima. If you do, it gains whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. If Cosima is exiled, you may put a Voyage counter on it. If you don't, return Cosima to the battlefield with X 1/1 counters and draw X cards, where X is the number of Voyage counters. So that is just a lot of words. But Cosima is a 3 mana 2/4 that can kind of sit around and block. And at our upkeep, we can exile her. And I mean, if we're just playing mono blue, we're just going to, I guess, get 1 land if we're lucky. But you're definitely going to want to throw Cosima into a deck, especially with green, that can ramp out a couple lands on a turn. She comes back. You know, maybe we played 3 lands this turn. She gets 3+1 counters, and we get to draw 3 cards. And then she can do it again at the beginning of your upkeep. You can exile Cosima, so you can do it the next turn. She'll lose the counters, but you can kind of start that process over again. So the creature side of Cosima has some uses in a green-blue deck, I guess. And if you're running more colors, I guess it's just more card draw. But she flips into her vehicle side. You can cast her for the Omen Keel, which is 2 mana, 1 and a blue, legendary artifact vehicle. Whenever a vehicle you control deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles that many cards from the top of their library. You may play lands from among those exiled cards as long as they remain exiled with a crew 1. So it's a 3/3. And now the Omen Keel is actually pretty cool because it says whenever a vehicle you control deals damage. So it's not saying whenever the Omen Keel deals damage. So if you slot this into any vehicle-heavy deck that you have, maybe you're buying the new vehicle deck from Neon Dynasty, and you throw the Omen Keel in there, and you can definitely, you just get free lands, which seems really nice. You're missing your land drops. You can just play your opponents, especially if you're giving all your vehicles and whatnot unblockable. So this could be a deck on its own using Cosima as the commander, but I definitely think this fits better than anything else that you're going to run centering on vehicles. Now, the next card we're going to talk about is the dreaded Kitten Wagon that has dominated Standard since its release. So, Asikas Chariot is 3 and a green for a 4/4. When Asikas Chariot enters the battlefield, we create 2 2/2 green cat creature tokens. And whenever Asikas Chariot attacks, we create a token that's a copy of a target token we control with crew 4. So, Asikas Chariot comes down as a 4/4. Brings with it 2 2/2, so it brings enough to crew it, and their tokens. So it brings It brings the crew to crew the chariot, and it brings targets for us to make more cats. But if we have other things like what's been going on in Standard recently, which is the tree folk that Ren and 7 creates, and you just create a bunch of tree folk that are XX based on your lands, and Asikas Chariot just absolutely pops off. And I can see being a token-heavy deck in Commander. You want to throw Asikas Chariot in there and just start making copies of all your cool tokens. Asikas Chariot fits in that style of deck. It's great in Standard. It's a powerhouse. It is a 4/4, and you do have to attack. So finding a way to make this thing bigger or giving it unblockable is going to be key, especially later in Commander games. But creating copies of your amazing tokens that I know that Commander games can create, Asikas Chariot would just be broken and bust the game wide open. That's what it does in Standard, and I can definitely see it doing that in Commander. So we have now hit the time where we are going to move on and talk about the newest set, Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. And there are so many more rare and mythic artifacts in this set than any of the other ones. We basically equal the amount. We have gotten as many rare and mythic vehicles in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty as we've had in the past, as many sets as there has been since Kaladesh. So if that tells you how hard they're pushing vehicles, and we're going to discover if they've been good and if they are still going good, or if they're on a downward slope. So first, we're going to start off with the Surge Hacker Mech. For 4 mana, it's a 5/5 with Menace. When Surge Hacker Mech enters the battlefield, it deals damage equal to twice the number of vehicles you control to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls. So honestly, on its face, this thing seems pretty good, especially if you're running a huge vehicle deck in Commander or Standard. You just cast this thing for 4 mana, and when it enters the battlefield, so you get to remove something, and then it's got a crew 4 at a 5/5, and if you're running a bunch of other vehicles, it deals twice. So if you have 2 other vehicles, it's going to deal 4 damage, which actually seems pretty solid for the amount of mana you're paying for it. And you get a 5/5 with Menace that you can crew later and just hopefully beat face with. So this thing isn't exactly the greatest rare, but it's definitely got its uses. The next one that we're going to talk about is the Mecha Titan Core. So for 2 mana, it's a 2/4 vehicle, so it's got crew 2 at a 2/4. So pay 5 mana, exile Mecha Titan Core and 4 other artifact creatures and or vehicles you control. Then create Mecha Titan, a legendary 10/10 construct artifact creature token with flying, vigilance, trample, lifelink, and haste, and it is all colors. When that token leaves the battlefield, return all cards exiled with Mecha Titan Core, except Mecha Titan Core, to the battlefield tapped under their owner's control. I need to take a break after reading all of that. But anyway, the Mecha Titan Core being at 2 mana for a 2/4, you're probably not going to crew this thing for its crew 2. But the paying 5 and exiling the core and 4 other artifacts, we're just going to create Voltron. So we're going to just create a new deck. It's called Voltron, and we're going to make Voltron, power him up, and just swing in. So our 10/10 with Flying, Vigilance, Trample, Lifelink, and Haste, that's all colors, is just going to kill someone in Commander. Definitely see why this is cool, but I definitely see why it's not necessarily good. There are kind of a lot of hoops to jump through, and it's definitely funny. It seems more or less like a meme strategy, but could definitely be cool if you're going for that. All right, next up is the Mindlink Mech. So for 2 and a blue, we get a 4/3 flying. Whenever Mindlink Mech becomes crewed for the first time each turn until end of turn, Mindlink Mech becomes a copy of target non-legendary creature that crewed it this turn, except it's 4/3. It's a vehicle artifact in addition to its other types and has flying. So it's crew 1. So it's nice. It's got a low crew cost. It's a 4/3 flyer. You can use it as a blocker or to just swing in for 3 mana. Definitely doesn't seem overpriced. But its ability, you can, again, copy something that has an attack trigger, but then it doesn't become a 10/10. It just becomes whatever that thing is as a 4/3. Definitely seems like, again, not exact. It's no Asikas Chariot by any means, but it seems okay. Copying and getting an attack trigger just seems like a lot of work, but being a crew once, you're turning a 1/1 token into a 4/3 with flying, definitely seems like it's okay. It just doesn't really have a lot of utility past that. Next up is the Makotai Soul Ripper. So for 1 and a black, we get a 4/3. Whenever Makotai Soul Ripper attacks, you may sacrifice another artifact or creature. And if you do, put a 1/1 counter on the Makotai Soul Ripper, and it gains Menace until end of turn with Crew 2. So 2 mana for a 2/2, or 2 mana, Crew 2 for a 4/3. And it's a sack outlet that we can use, and it puts a 1/1 counter and a Menace counter. I think this card is pretty good if you're going for a sacrifice deck in Standard or even Commander. I'm not sure if this fits in with the sacrifice archetype, as that is a archetype in Commander that is so solid and established where it doesn't really need another piece, especially one that has to attack. So I don't think this thing is necessarily great for Commander. It could be useful in Standard if that's a deck, but again, not exactly the best sacrifice outlet, which is kind of the only thing that it has going for it. Next, we're going to talk about the Reckoner Bankbuster. So this card has definitely found a home in the Azorius artifacts alongside Tezzeret. It's a 2 mana, Crew 3, 4/4. So it enters with 3 charge counters on it. You pay 2 mana and tap the Bankbuster to remove a charge counter. You draw a card. Then if there are no charge counters on the Bankbuster, you create a treasure token and a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token with this creature crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. So it technically crews. One of these tokens can crew the Bankbuster. Now this has definitely emerged as a great card. It's basically a 2 mana, throw it on the battlefield, and you can just draw 3 cards later on. And then once you've drawn your 3rd card, you make a creature and you make a treasure token. So you can just do a lot of stuff with this card. It's definitely super popular, and it grows great in control builds where you can just kind of hold something off to the side until you have the means to use it. And it even creates something that can activate this. So the Bankbuster is definitely the shining light in the Neon Dynasty vehicles so far. So that was actually it for the Neon Dynasty vehicles in Standard, which honestly, after looking through this list at the Mythic and Rares for Neon Dynasty, not super impressed, to be honest. I think that there are definitely some it's a good avenue that Magic is trying to go towards, but I think where it really shines is this new Commander deck that they've made. It's an Azorius vehicle deck. And the first card on there is Imposter Mech. So for 2 mana, 1 and a blue, we get a 3/1. You may have Imposter Mech enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature an opponent controls, except it's a vehicle artifact with Crew 3, and it loses all other card types. So Imposter Mech is entering the battlefield as a copy, so it will get enter the battlefield effects. It does become it becomes a vehicle with Crew 3, so if we wanted to attack with it, we're going to have to tap up to power 3 to attack with something big that we create a copy of. But I like where this is at. It's kind of hoops to jump through, but it's still a good reward because we get to copy some really powerful thing from our opponents. And it also becomes it's an artifact vehicle, so it sits off to the side until we crew it. It doesn't become a creature until we crew it, if what I believe is correct about vehicles. So it can kind of stay off to the side in its own realm. It can't be targeted with other creatures, and it remains the copy until we crew 3. Then it becomes a creature in addition to its other types as the vehicle works, if I'm to be believed. The next card in that same vein of the new Commander deck that I want to talk about is the Peacewalker Colossus. So for 3 mana, it's a 6/6 with Crew 4. But it has this nifty ability where we pay 1 and a white, and another target vehicle becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. So if any of you have played with Karn Silver Golem, it does the same thing where you pay 4 mana, and that creature artifact becomes a creature artifact with its power and toughness being its mana cost. And that's what the Peacewalker Colossus is doing, except it's for other vehicles. So basically it's allowing vehicles to get around crew costs, and it's really great. It just seems like a cool addition. Like, this is definitely something that I would want in a vehicle deck. It's 3 mana, so it's cheap. It's a 6/6, so we can use it for later Crew 4. But mainly, we just want to keep it off to the side so we can keep using that 1 and a white ability. The next I want to talk about is the Aerial Surveyor. So this thing is definitely something that mono white needs. And I feel like Wizards is doing that a lot lately, where they're just kind of throwing mono white a bone a little bit here and there. And this is definitely a card that fits in so beautifully with that. So it is a 2 and a white 3/4 flying. Whenever Aerial Surveyor attacks, if defending player controls more lands than you, search your library for a basic plains and put it onto the battlefield tapped. And it's Crew 2. So it's 3 mana, low crew cost. It's a 3/4 flyer, so it's got some blocking. It's got some beefiness. That way, it's not going to die when it attacks. So maybe you'll get 2 or 3 lands out of this thing. It can just ramp you back into the game if you're mono white, or if you're playing something that doesn't ramp lands, such as Azorius. This card is definitely going to be nice. It's going to get some combat flowing early on, and this is exactly what Magic has been trying to do, especially with mono white, and it is a beautiful addition to that. So last but not least, we're going to talk about the Artifact Vehicle Commander that has come with the Artifact Vehicle Commander deck. Now, I'm not talking about the other commander, the face commander of the deck, just because that is not a vehicle. It was an artificer, I believe. So this one is Shorikai, the Genesis engine. So for 2 white and a blue, we have an 8/8 with crew 8. So for 1 mana and tapping Shorikai, the Genesis engine, we're going to draw 2 cards, then discard a card. Create a 1/1 colorless pilot that says this creature crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. So we're drawing a card and then discarding a card. So we're going up a card. This is just card draw on our commander. We are having to tap our mega 8/8, but if we can't crew this thing right now, then it doesn't really matter. And we're also creating something that can crew this. So this card just synergizes. Its first ability is just synergizing so well with itself. And then it has the crew 8, and then below it says Shorikai, Genesis engine can be your commander. So there's not really anything else going for this card other than the fact that it's a 4 mana. You just draw 2 cards. You have to discard a card, but in white and blue, maybe you could put in some way to recur those cards or get some extra use out of your cards if they're in the graveyard. So you're going up a card and you're going up a creature that can crew your commander. So, looking back on everywhere that Wizards has hit with their vehicle lineup, I definitely love the vehicles that they introduced in Kaladesh and those early stages of Aether Revolt and stuff like that. It was a great introduction to these cool vehicles that were artifacts, but also kind of creatures, but were also not creatures. There's just like a cool subtype to experiment with. And then we got into the Ixalan, and they didn't really make anything that was super useful and really wowed anyone with that. And then as we moved through and we got into more War of the Spark, and they started to experiment more with colored artifacts and things like what that looks like and what the artifacts would do, the vehicles would do if they were based in certain colors, which led to the rise of the Kaldheim vehicles being based on colors. And the vehicles in Kaldheim I remember being pretty good, especially Asikas Chariot, which is still in the format that just totally wrecks face. And now we are on to Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, which seems to be taking that utility vehicle slot that much further. And I think that all of the vehicles in Neon Dynasty definitely hit their mark of where they want to be. They may not be super powerful and busted like in Asikas Chariot, but they definitely do things, and they can fit in a multitude of decks. And I think that the star of the artifact vehicle world right now in Neon Dynasty is definitely that Reckoner Bankbuster. And if you haven't experimented throwing that in a few standard decks, it's obviously colorless. You can throw it in any deck. If you just want to draw some cards, it's there to refill your hand, and it can be used as a creature later, especially with the things that it creates. But all in all, I think where vehicles at in a whole is they started out in this experimental phase. They dipped down into like a phase where they were almost considered too powerful or too good, so they didn't make them as good. And now I think they're on the rise again of being, they were on the rise in Kaladesh, and now they're seeming to settle down a little bit more in Neon Dynasty, where they're hitting this space where they're filling a really good utility role that could become a creature, but it's not necessarily like you want to make it a creature and attack every time with this because it's so broken, like the Chariot. But all the vehicles are seeming to bring something together where they can just kind of pile up and they can do something more targeted that a deck is trying to do. So we're going to try and answer the question, are vehicles good now? And I honestly think that the vehicles now are just as good, if not just a little bit better than they always have been, because in Kaladesh and Aether Revolt, vehicles were amazing. They definitely did a lot for the decks of that era. Then they kind of moved into a little bit more of an abnormality in the later sets. And now with Kaldheim and Neon Dynasty, they have moved back into this mid, maybe a little over pushed area where they do a lot of stuff for the decks that they're in. And are they good now? Yes. Were they good when they first came out? Also, yes. Did they hit a slump? Yes. But are vehicles good now? I think you can make the argument that they were never bad, for standard at least. And as we're looking at these in a commander standpoint, I would definitely say that the earlier vehicles were geared way more towards standard. And as we move further along, we get some of the big flashy vehicles like the Parhelion 2. And as we're moving into the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty section of vehicles, I definitely think that something like the Mecha Titan Core or the Imposter Mech and 100% the Aerial Surveyor, those cards, they just go into commander decks regardless. They don't need to be in a certain deck like a standard deck or a deck dealing with energy or anything like that. They can just go into the deck because they're great. So are they good now for commander? I guess you could argue that they are good because the past vehicles weren't really suited for large multiplayer games such as commander. They were designed for standard. So are they better now? Of course they are, because they are coming. Some of them are coming with a commander deck, so it's that 4-player game mode in mind. But I hope that this helped you break down some things or questions or things about rare and mythic vehicles that have been throughout Magic's history. I've always thought vehicles are interesting, and again, like I've said throughout this video, just they seem almost in like this weird, uncomfortable, pushed subtype group. So I thought it'd be interesting to just look and see where vehicles were at when they first came out and how they've evolved and what they've really done for the standard game and how they're used in Commander, which honestly isn't a whole lot. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more content like this, make sure to like and subscribe and comment. Let me know what kind of video you'd like to see next, what kind of deck breakdown, card talking about, deck talking about, doing whatever. I love to do all of this stuff, and if you just leave a comment letting me know what you're looking to see more from, and make sure to like and subscribe and follow along. Thanks.